Thank you, Agnes. I'm grateful to Professor Carl Hansen for serving as today's discussant. Carl is Professor of Law and Director of the University of Geneva's Center for Children's Rights Studies. He's the Program Director of the Master of Advanced Studies in Children's Rights and Chair of the Steering Committee of the Children's Rights European Academic Network. Along with Patrick Thomas, Carl and I maintain a long-term interest in studying children's ombudspersons. I turn it over to Carl, and thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Brian, for this invitation, and also congratulations to you and Agnes. I think first because I think you both are the reason why we are gathering today. I mean, you've compiled this wonderful book on the roles of independent children's rights institutions in advancing human rights of children, and I think this webinar gives us a glimpse of the density and of the richness of the book, and I really wanted to congratulate you with that. And indeed, Brian, it goes back to this long-standing ambition that we had, and I quote also from your introduction to the book. It's the importance of advancing knowledge on independent human rights institutions for children, the ICRIs, or well, the ombuds, as we might call them all together. And I think there's so many questions we could ask, so I can only concentrate on a few, and this panel we have a short time, but I'll come back to a few topics on which I think I would be glad to see a discussion amongst us. But maybe first, to situate it further, the questions we can ask, or the kind of questions we can engage with are, well, I do think we are at a time now in history where we can ask empirical questions. Like many of these questions are answered in the chapters also in the book. What are these ombuds for children, or these independent institutions? Why have they been set up? What are their powers? Can we compare them? So all these very interesting questions, and I think a lot of them have also been brought up during the presentations we've just heard. But you can also ask these empirical questions. You can also ask quite some normative questions also, like, well, do we need them? Does the international legal framework, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, does it oblige states to have one? But also other sides is what to do with them in federal states. I had a chance to travel between Belgium and Switzerland, which are two federal states, and it is not so easy. And I see also, like in the context of the UK, how to really put them and the normative framework where to situate them in this legal field might be complicated. But then we also ask evaluative questions, and I think a lot of the politicians, if they would be following us, I doubt if there are many, but if they would ask questions like, well, but tell me, why would I spend my money on an ombuds? Do they have some impact? Is it worthwhile? Is it really worthwhile to have them? Because of course my resources are limited. So if you want me to spend them on an ombuds, is that, well, what's the concrete effect? And also, and that's a bit one of the points I like to I would say engage with. There's also many theoretical questions, I think, that are interesting around what's this kind of bizarre institution. We had the trias politicus, we had the legislature, the judges, and the administration, or the executive, and now we have something in between. There's like a fourth level, and so where do we put it, and how can we understand these ombuds? So on these different levels, we can continue engaging with questions. And again, I thank you and congratulate you, Agnes and Brian, for having compiled this book that brings us along in all those different directions. Now, for the panel, I'd like to take us to three topics. The one is on independence, another one is on representation, and the last one is on the translation between the international and the national level. So my first topic goes on independence, and of course you all mentioned it. I think Bruce said we are independent. Also in the compilation of text, like the author who writes on Pakistan speaks about the suo motu powers, and I think also and Agnes, you spoke about the definition itself of an ICRI is an independent, so we speak about that. And also in Ireland, we had this own volition investigations. And so all of this speaks about these suo motu powers. You have an independent power, and I would, my question is one where I'm wondering, could you give some further examples of where these ombuds that you have been, or Emily, or that we have studied, or that you actually are, like Bruce, is there examples of where you have had the idea, this was me, my institution, we have put this independently on the agenda? So could you give examples? And of course there are limits to it. We had also examples of the limits of soft power, of its impact, but just give us some further ideas of where does that lead us to? That would be my first round of questions. I don't know who wants, and it's open. I mean, if you want to take the floor, please go ahead.
Bruce, do you want to respond?
Absolutely. I think independence is absolutely key. And here in Scotland, where I'm appointed by the head of state, our late Queen, on nomination of the Scottish Parliament, and operate entirely independent of government. So I have no legal relationship with government. And so a lot of that work then is working with children and young people to try and set the agenda. But to be honest, most of our work is quite reactive to the government's agenda. But some really clear examples would be the one that I used earlier on physical punishment, where the government had no interest in bringing that forward. It wasn't politically popular. And it was actually us working with an opposition member from the Green Party in the Parliament that went forward. It wasn't a government initiative, and the government opposed it until quite late in the process, when they realized that they would lose that. And so that was a really good example of us working with civil society and children and young people to bring forward an essential legal reform, which the government opposed. The less successful one with age equal responsibility and incorporation of the CRC as well. That's been a civil society campaign working with children and young people, which the government opposed over a very, very long time, and only quite recently came on board with it. So you do need to convince government eventually, but generally when we're setting the agenda, it's by building up a strong evidence base, by encouraging child human rights defenders to really lead the process, and to build up civil society partnerships, using the media to try and really challenge government. And that's how we've got some of those things onto the agenda.
Can you, Emily and Ursula, are you for Ireland? Are there, I think, well, so we have this topic, so physical punishment was something put on the agenda, like the agenda setting, because that's part of the, I would say, the independence power. Do you have examples where you've succeeded in at least having people talk about a topic which without the institution would have never made it to the agenda?
Emily, you're muted.
My goodness, 3 years in, you think, I'd remember the old mute button. Yes, thanks, Carl. We are also institutionally independent and Paris Principle compliant, so that accountability is directly to Parliament. And when that matters is like Bruce said, when government are unwilling to advance something, and that generally happens when the issue itself is not popular with voters. So for us in Ireland, it was children in detention, in particular children in prisons. There was a plan, but it wasn't moving. We couldn't hear children's voices. It was outside of the remit of the institutions. So the most creative thing we did was to go in and speak to 35 young teenage boys between the ages of 16 and 18 to find out their experience. That then went to the UN Committee Against Torture. So like Bruce, not necessarily the traditional pathway of the UNCRC, but the UNCAT, who internationally then brought, I suppose, the kind of shame on the Irish society and government for its treatment of children in institutions. Change at constitutional level was very much, it was unpopular politically. They did not want to, they certainly were not receptive in the very beginning to that. That became, if I'm to be honest about it, a personal obsession. And sometimes there are things that you feel very strongly about. It, again, like Bruce said, it began as a civil society. It emerged as a civil society debate. It was taken up by one of our now retired Supreme Court justices, but it was really accelerated, I think, by ourselves in the Ombudsman for Children's Office. But I do remember getting quietly and informally getting political backlash for the work that I was doing, you know, being taken aside at events and getting an earful from politicians. They won't do it publicly, but they will say to you, what you really need to stop what you're doing. So those moments are the moments when you know that you're actually making some kind of progress.
Yeah, so that's when you say, yes, I was successful when they put you in a corner wanting to discuss something private with you. Which is quite challenging, I guess, as a job. Ursula, did you, because I think you used this nice word of own volition, like on investigative powers. Are there, on what kind of topics would an ombudsman then use his or her own volition, this autonomy in deciding on what to put your resources and your time and.
Yeah, and look, this is the ultimate question. The latter part of what you've just said, Carl. How do you decide how to use your limited power and your limited resources to maximum effect? And I think what our experience would show is that you gather all that information, intelligence, and evidence systematically over a period of time, and either look to use the own volition power on matters that are of grave concern. Or of widespread concern. And I think probably child protection fell into both of those categories, really. And I think, I'm not sure if it fell into this express category, but certainly the whole area of children in our system of direct provision in terms of separated children and what could be galvanized through the good offices of the Ombudsman. I think that was a really interesting exercise of that authority. So using that soft power to bring people together, you know, and I have a more recent example of that where the current office wrote asking questions about a particular area of interest, and the response was that they would use the office to bring people together. So using that authority and the identity of the office to effect change collaboratively, I think is a really interesting model. So, and I think what we found also is that some of the powers, it's certainly sometimes difficult to say which precise power is being used, and some of that is a really creative response to using the integrity of the office in those really important ways.
Maybe I might turn to Agnes, but maybe it's a political difficult question, or at least within Europe we see Hungary, which is under threat, under pressure. It is not a government, I guess, that is very friendly towards having independent human rights watchdogs in-house. I mean, how is that in a country where things are a bit more, I would say, well, or at least from the outside, where you could see that this is not easy, or this must certainly not be easy to uphold this idea of independence vis-a-vis a government in general that is not so human rights oriented, for the least, if that's the least I could say.
Yes, I don't know, Carl, why do you think that it's hard?
Oh, I just happened to think that.
No, it's just a joke. Yeah. So yeah, it's challenging. But so when I thinking back, so the Ombudsman institution was always seen by the public or by the political elite like a soap in the eye, let's say, because when I just look back to the time of 2009 and 15, so a bit earlier, the parliamentary plenary didn't hear to the Ombudsman. So, you know, he submitted the annual yearbook to the parliament, and there was no debate, no plenary debate. They just decided not to discuss it for long years because they had some problems with some words of the Ombudsman that time, and his office was not renewed. So yeah, officially and formally and legally and in a normative way, all the guarantees of independence is there, but still, he's part of the political game, and it is. And now in the current situation, let me illustrate with one thing, that the Amnesty International in Hungary just ran a campaign with the photo of the commissioner, like in the missing children of the milk box, you know, milk box in the US. Do you know what I mean? So, and they ran the campaign that, have you seen this guy? So because he's been like an invisible one, and however the staff is working there hard, the complaints are submitted to the Ombudsman institution still, and they are running investigations, but no one knows. It's okay, it's a bit, you know, sharply saying, but yeah, so it's challenging, and it's a part of the game.
Brian, could you, I'm turning to you, Brian, just, is there anything more general, because we have several themes and we do need to, I think by itself, the notion of independence, we could spend a whole webinar, I guess, on how that works out and where it comes from. But maybe, do you have any general ideas about your connections with members of VNOC, and widely spoken, this whole idea of independent national human rights institutions for children, and what are the stakes today with the independence?
Yeah, it's a great question. And one of the chapters in the book is with Robin Shura on independence. Robin and I are working with someone named Michelle Gatto on this project around independence. We find when we look at independence, there are different components of independence. And so we're trying to map that out across ENOC institutions, different aspects instead of just one word about independence. The other thing I would say from research, and this is true of our projects with you, Carl, that independence matters, as the panelists have said, when they are speaking up and in a way going against popular opinion or going against political opinion. And that's when it counts a lot, being able to exert their independence and then their powers to advocate on behalf of young people. Thank you.
Okay, if you don't mind, I wanted to move to the second part, to a second topic, which is the one on representation and well, it's a representation, participation. But I start with what I think Agnes wrote about complaints. So in her chapter, she writes that complaints received by children are few. That's a nice way of saying that. Well, I guess it might be, well, Bruce, you might have another status or idea about it. As I understand it, your institution does not receive direct individual complaints, but as for Ireland and as for Hungary. So, and well, I know it also from previous work, literature, discussions with people that so ombudspersons who have this function of receiving individual complaints, and that is then meant for children and young people because that's what the institution is about. In reality, they receive the vast majority of complaints is not by people under 18, but it is by adults speaking on their behalf. I have a few questions about that. Maybe that is not a problem. So my first question is, do you think that is a problem? Maybe that is just normal. And is there a way of how can you explain how that comes? And then I would also say, well, can we do something about it if you think we need to do something about it? Maybe you say that's how it is and we don't need to do something about it. But I might first ask Emily and Ursula, who have this, well, in Ireland, you have this outspoken and as the model also, and you know also of the practices of colleagues who have the similar kind of function to receive individual complaints.
Well, our youngest complainant was a 4-year-old girl with a disability. And we got a very good outcome for, essentially she was complaining that she was a wheelchair user and was not allowed to get an electric wheelchair until she was 7, because the policy was that not until a child is chronologically 7 were they capable of using an electric wheelchair safely. In summary, the outcome of that was not for just that individual child, but she actually changed the policy for everybody. But our experience is the same as everybody else. Few children make complaints. If you think of the nature of complaints, the construct of complaints is an adult construct. So you can hear when you listen to Bruce, you can get very rich information, a rich data from hearing children's views and utilizing Article 12. I found the investigations, I have to say the complaints and investigations very, very useful. But I would be less worried, Carl. I wouldn't be worried that the complaint has to come from the individual child. Where it's a problem is where you have children without parental care or guardians. So children in detention, children in state care, children in international protection settings or any residential setting where they're without a parent or guardian. That's when it becomes problematic. And that's where the UN committee has been very strong on this, and ombudsmen and commissioners have been very strong to do targeted work with children of least advantage for whom you may need to make greater efforts to hear their concerns. So perhaps just reframing that into concerns rather than complaints, you may get the same information that will allow you utilize the power of the institution.
Yeah. And Agnes, is there something, well, it was your observation that I took as a starting point for.
Yeah, just a few words that so I'm not sure, of course, that all the complaints. So this is the only way when we will receive information about children's lives, but on the other hand, it's an important one. So we need to improve ourselves in that way to be more child friendly, or at least more visible for them. Because what also Emily said, that there are also the possibility to turn to these institutions for guardians, for child psychologists, for different actors who can help and support children, and also have a signal in their head if there is something went wrong with the child. So we need to be at least more visible towards the children.
Yeah, I know, Bruce, is just something on that notion, because, well, you do, I think, well, as I understand your institution, because you don't have these individual complaints, you are yourself obliged to reach out to young people and children.
Absolutely, and while we don't take complaints, we do receive communication from and we have a free call line and things, and it has exactly the same experience. The vast majority are adults. The reason why the Scottish Parliament chose not to follow the Ombuds model is that they argued, I think wrongly, that there was already adequate access to justice for children because there's a public services ombudsperson, and they looked to the court system. But as has been mentioned, it's not only that children don't have political rights, it's that complaint systems are designed in a very adult way, and they don't speak to the way in which children want an effective remedy. So we're doing a big piece of work around looking at trying to create effective remedies for children and young people. And as Emily and others have said, when we've used our investigative powers or our strategic litigation powers, they've been very targeted on children, particularly those that don't otherwise have an adequate voice. And so restraint and seclusion work, many of those children were non-verbal. The work that we've done around children in detention, we're primarily focused on care experience children and young people. And so part of it is working directly with children and young people to make sure that they can be part of the design of achieving an outcome for them and others. And so that's a big part of the human rights defenders work that we're trying to do, is to ensure that we can actually get some system change, because adults' complaint systems are very seldom going to be able to provide an effective remedy for children.
Yeah. Go say then live with Brian, whether I can get also to my third question, or you want me to go to the Q&A, or can I address the...
I think if it can be brief, yeah.
Okay, I'll try to, because I wanted to, well, I start with Ursula with the question. And for me, it's an idea, when I read through the book, and so it's about the international versus the national level. And when you read through the chapters, the emphasis very often on the international, how much the Committee on the Rights of the Child, concluding observations, general comments, they are used as guidelines and they inform the work of national ombudspersons for children. But there is less to see on the opposite. Maybe there was one quote from Bruce, who wrote that he spoke about the work of the CRC and ENOC has both influenced and been influenced, so that there was a reciprocity. Now that was in Bruce's text, it was during the pandemic, but a bit further down, Brian, you also write on the influence ENOC had on the general comment number 2, because of course, general comment number 2, who asks countries to have an independent ombuds or institution, has also been influenced by ENOC itself, who helped drafting general comment number 2. Or there's also a chapter by Susanna Rutai, who sees, well, how ombudspersons seek also international support to do then their work nationally. At least there is a in general, in the literature, you see, of course, it's important that you can rely on international standards that help you do your job nationally. But my question is, do you see also evidence of the opposite? In my opinion, ombuds are very close also to what lives in a country on a national level amongst children, what they think is important. Do you see any examples of ombuds putting what they see from children to the committee? And do they influence at one point, like the agenda setting of general comments adopted by the committee? So where it would be really the other way around, it's not the committee that, well, safeguards, or the system safeguards what happens locally, but also the reverse. That was my last kind of series of
Yeah.
questions I had.
Thanks, Carl. It's a really interesting question. I would kind of just start by saying I think that the national level is absolutely essential to the implementation of children's rights. That's where the convention is implemented. It's where children live. They don't live in the international community. So I think it's really pivotal, and that's why the independent institutions at national level are so important. And in a way, they somehow represent that sort of watchdog monitoring body at a national level on behalf of the committee, as it were, in some states at least, or in some forms. I think some of the challenges is around the diversity of models that we have, the mix and variety, and certainly that's something we're looking very closely at across Europe at the moment in particular, but also across globally. And I suppose, what I would say is, you pointed to ENOC and other institutions like that having an advocacy role at an international level. There's a very powerful case to be made from experience of the independent institution playing a direct role in the whole process of reporting. It's absolutely key, and separate and distinct from that played by NGOs, by civil society more broadly. And I think it's interesting, I think, case studies to be had there about how well that works together or not, separate voices or one single voice. And I think the influence of it is absolutely clear. I think particularly in hosting the rapporteur, or from either the committee or from other UN bodies when they come to visit nationally, being the representative of the community in a very official way, I think is very important. So I think that relationship is dynamic and plays out in different ways, but is hugely important. Yeah.
Yeah. Did you, Bruce, have any impact on the agenda setting of the committee? Like, is there a general comment, a day of discussion where you had the agenda was like on some of the topics that you think were influenced by you or by colleagues at ENOC?
Absolutely, and I think we often talk about ICRIs or NHRIs as a bridge between the international community and the domestic implementation. And so it's really key we're bringing those standards to domestic implementation, but it's also really important for us that Children's Voice, for me, Children's Voice from Scotland and across Europe through ENOC, are part of that decision making. And I think we've seen that at its best through the Committee on the Rights of the Child, which has been very responsive to those voices, both in relation to country reviews, but also in terms of days of general discussion setting, general comment setting, again, on things like the environment, very much driven by young people, at the current general comment that's being drafted, the need to review the general comment on child justice. There's been lots and lots of examples where, and if you look on ENOC's website, you can see all of the statements that we've made, and you'll see how closely they link in with the international agenda. Where I think that there's a real gap is in the other treaty bodies and the charter side of the UN. While we will see, for example, the Human Rights Council from time to time taking the views of children, it's not done systematically, and outside of the Committee on the Rights of the Child, it's not as good as it could be. And I think there's a real strengthening that needs to be done, recognizing that children have the right to participate on all issues that affect them. So it's not just contained within the CRC system. And so I think there's a huge piece of work that we need to do about getting children's voices into the whole of the international machinery. And I think ICRIs play an absolutely essential role there because of the recognition that the system does give to us.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Brian, I go to you.
Thank
Brian,
you.
so you do the Q&A.
Yep.
Thanks a lot for this,
Thank you, Carl, and thank you.
conversation.
Yeah, we have several questions, and hopefully we can get to them. And I apologize. One is actually from Linda McDonald, and let me see. Linda, do you want to ask a question to the group before we switch over to the Q&A that have been posted? We need, if you can unmute. Linda, are you able to? Well, let me go to another question while we're waiting on that. Bruce, there was a question posed earlier. If you could respond to that, if you still have the question. I think it's been from Nick Tart.
Yeah.
Okay.
So this was in relation to the age of criminal responsibility only moving to 12, and what the government's reasoning for that was. They argued that we already had other mechanisms for that most children were diverted into a welfare-based children's hearing system, and that actually that system would struggle to deal with the most serious cases. But ultimately, it was a political failure, in my view. It's not popular. They didn't want to be seen as weak on crime, despite significant evidence within Scotland and internationally that it's counterproductive to use the criminal law to address harmful behaviour of children, despite intervention from the Committee on the Rights of the Child and the Commissioner for Human
Oh no, oh no, oh no.
Rights, the Council of Europe, who were very clear that 14 was the absolute minimum, and that you should be looking much higher than that. It was purely a political decision, and actually they then delayed and put in place some punitive measures in relation to children under 12 in terms of collection of their information. So a huge amount of sense, although we did secure a review which is ongoing to increase it hopefully in future.
Thank you. Emily, I think Michelle Gatto asked you a question about bodily autonomy, if you want to respond. You're muted.
Michelle asked the question about the liberalisation of abortion laws in Ireland recently, and the question of LGBTQ rights in relation to bodily autonomy. So I had just said to Michelle, there are two things. One is that before the liberalisation of abortion laws came in, Ireland liberalised, if you like, the gender recognition laws. So as Ombudsman for Children, I was asked my opinion back in 2013. So I've sent a link to you, Michelle, on the submission to Parliament in relation to gender recognition. And that went through our Parliament and was passed in 2015. And then the abortion law followed that. What was interesting there is I discussed this matter with the current Ombudsman for Children, because for some reason in Ireland, people weren't able to take the fact that the Ombudsman for Children might advocate in the context of a liberalisation of abortion context. So at that stage, I was Chief Commissioner of the Human Rights Commission, and we agreed that I would do it under the banner of the National Human Rights Institution. So in our submission, we covered the fact that there are 300 teenage girls a year that were travelling to the UK for abortion. So the issue of bodily autonomy for children was covered by the National Human Rights Institution at the time, but just to mention that gender recognition was also, and I've sent that link, I think I've sent that link to Michelle.
Okay, thank you. Sandrine asks, and then we'll go to the other ones, about advancing children's rights policies or programs in developing countries, for instance, Africa. I'll just respond quickly. There is, it's a great question. There's an African Charter on the rights and welfare of the child. Of the African countries, 41 have ratified, 9 have signed, and 5 have not taken a step. There are in some countries, independent children's rights institutions, but there's, and this is true of other places in the world. There was a study now dated from UN Innocenti about children's ombudspersons around the world, but it's a great question. Stefan asked, are you aware of children's rights institutions in which children themselves take part in leadership? Why don't we quickly have Emily and Bruce, Agnes respond?
I think probably my information's outdated, so Bruce is better placed to give you an update here.
It's my absolute favorite thing. We're still learning, but I've had as I said, when I first got appointed, we traveled around the country and spoke to children and young people, and that was one of the big things that they wanted to know more about, is how they could get involved. And so we've had a series of young advisors groups, and the current which has evolved each year. I've now actually got 3 groups. One is looking particularly at the ENOC topic, which was the environment, and is now ICRIs. One is actually I've delegated my investigation powers to them, and so they've got a project which they've decided to focus on mental health, and they're actually using the investigation powers in the office on their own with some staff support, but not directed by me, which we're going to write up as a model as well. And then there's a separate governance group, and I think this one is one that I think is really interesting, in that they helped young advisors helped write our strategic plan, but we're now trying to get them involved in budget setting within the office, and even bring them into kind of audit and other elements of the office as well. And so we've always tried to get them involved in the way in which we work, but it's an evolving process. And I think that that's probably true with a lot of colleagues as well, is that it's something that we're still kind of developing. And I would say in Scotland, we generally work with older children as well, kind of 12, 14 and above. We're not as good at involving younger children in our work in terms of the governance and running of the office. We do a lot of work with them on policy and kind of project issues, a lot of work out and about engaging with them. But in terms of those questions about how we spend our money, how we run our governance, how we prioritize our work, I think there's some more work to do about how you involve children and young people in our governance, but we're trying to develop some good practice models.
Thank you. Stefan asked how to navigate the question of true political power and support. As an ICRI, the institution is not part of the government. As an ombudsman governmental office, political power is soft. Is that a frustrating situation between dependence and independence? I'm not sure that's inaccurate. Whether it's true that political power is soft, I think many of you are endowed with powers.
And in fact, I mean, politics will always respond. It's a universal matter that politicians will respond to child protection issues. They often respond very quickly and very publicly to issues that concern the public. So something that will concern their voters. We had an instance here in Ireland where a government fell because of its mishandling of child protection. So I wouldn't go so far as to call it soft. I think your work and the evidence that you get and that you publicly inform and educate about can be greater than described as soft.
And if I could jump in as well, so we do, as others do, have some hard powers in terms of strategic litigation and investigations, which are much stronger powers. And again, some of the quasi-judicial functions that some ICRIs have are hard power. But that kind of soft power, kind of profile and influencing is absolutely key. And I think that was one of the really important things in protecting the independence of our office. That was also important that the office was given the resources and status to have that influence. And so again, we have a very high media presence, very high kind of social media presence. We're able to support children and young people to have their voices heard. And I think that we would see that as an essential part of that independence, is also being able to be heard and being able to influence. And that does require the protection of the office to stand up and challenge government. But also there's some kind of, the reality of it is that challenging the government on unpopular issues is still very popular in media terms. So it makes for good stories and so there's very few things that I say that don't get picked up very, very quickly by the media, because generally I'm holding government and those in power to account. And so even when I'm putting forward a politically unpopular or generally unpopular view, it still gets a lot of kind of coverage, and there's power in kind of in building some of that as well and creating those conversations in communities.
Sorry, Brian, could I just add, I think one of the interesting things, I think the complaints process is a really direct level of accountability where the office, certainly in our experience, it's not a good day for a public servant when they receive a complaint by the Ombudsman for Children. Nobody wants to be at the wrong end of that. So I think that does play out in children's favour. Where I would be slightly more critical, I think, is in relation to the impact of the work that's done around advice and guidance to government. Endless reports and endless sort of and analyses from a convention point of view of law and policy, which don't get any response, where there's no follow through on what exactly has been done with the Ombudsman's advice. I think that's an area where we need to really look at how we can better, I suppose, be more systematic in how that's done at a national level, in particular, perhaps developing a level of formal parliamentary scrutiny of legislation, because I think that you could spend all of your resource responding to legislative proposals and making useful comments that never get picked up, because there's no requirement legally for government to respond to you or to take that advice on board.
Thank you. We have two related questions that I think Ursula just tapped into all of you. Sandrine asks, after assessing some challenges faced by children to address their complaints or having access to some procedures to address their problems, what are some tangible initiatives taken? I think you've talked a little bit about that, but if you want to spend a moment. And then Nick asked, do children's commissioners have a responsibility to influence public opinion? If you guys want to respond.
Well, I would just say briefly that that certainly in our experience, and being at the other side of this as well, the Ombudsman's complaints function is at its best when it's looking at systematic or system change. Emily gave a very good example of it in relation to the girl and the policy around wheelchair access. And I think then, you know, that's a key thing. I think you could equally, and this is often the criticism of those offices that have the complaints function, you could spend all of your resource responding to individual, very worthy children's complaints. But if that's not going to bring about a more systematic change, change in culture, change in policy, change in the way resources are decided, that's really, you know, a sort of thankless job in a way. So looking for the ways in which you can translate your individual complaints into something more systematic or system-wide, I think is really key. Being strategic about how those are used and picking those up and using them then on the own volition, more widespread investigations. I think that's really where the offices come into their own.
I want to invite Linda McDonald, come back to Linda, and then also another person attending named Ivy, if she would want to, if Ivy would want to speak up in a moment as well. But Linda, are you able to ask your question? Okay. And Ivy, if you are able to just, Ivy put into the Q&A, she is a child's rights advocate from Kenya. So the earlier question around Africa, she says that she's noted key similarities between the different jurisdictions and the Kenyan framework in the protection of children, particularly the provisions of the new Kenyan Children's Act of 2022. Okay, so thank you. And then I see a note. Linda, it seems that we cannot unmute you. We're not sure why. So if you want to post a question in the Q&A, that would be fantastic. If it's okay, I'll answer a few questions about the United States. Michelle Gatto asked, what impact does it have that the United States hasn't ratified the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child? Is there an international push to get the US to sign and create an ombudsman office? And then Kate asks, I know the US perspective on this. She's curious if the panelists have any anecdotal experience with their observations of the US political and institutional maneuverings. I'm picking up on similar trends from our panel's experiences. So I'll just quickly respond to one of those and then turn it over to the panelists about what they see about the United States. The United States, of course, is the only UN member party that's not ratified the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. Thanks. About half of our states have set up independent children's rights institutions, but they're very different from what you find elsewhere. And one of the ways that they're different is that they do not concentrate on the rights of all young people. We have two ombudspersons that kind of do, but for the most part, they either they focus on children in state custody, either in detention or in foster care. If you don't mind going to the next slide, please. There are efforts here in the United States that have been going on for quite a while about persuading leadership of the US government to ratify. When the first effort was made, more conservative forces were stronger. And so, and it was also a matter of poor political timing. Since then, there have been attempts to ratify the UN Convention. I won't say it's just a matter of time because that may be wrong, but I will say that the United States actually has ratified two optional protocols to the convention. One on involvement of children in armed conflict and the other on sale of children, prostitution, and pornography. So in the United States, we often think that the Democrats are the ones who are going to push for the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. But important to note that these two optional protocols were pursued during Republican administrations. So there are calls made to ratify the UN Convention on right now. And there are also calls to establish a national independent children's rights institution by the American Bar Association, including someone named Howard Davidson. So thank you. And then I'll turn to the panelists about their perceptions of the United States and what we're doing and not doing when it comes to children's rights, including in front of the UN.
I'll just jump in very briefly while people are maybe gathering their thoughts. I think there's a we published an edited collection last year, myself and a few colleagues, including Laura Lundy from Queen's, around the legal incorporation of the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And we probably controversially included a chapter on the United States from Jonathan Todres from Georgia State. And I think the point we were making was that actually an awful lot can be achieved without ratification, while ratification is the optimum. There are examples of how both states and cities, in fact, are taking the Convention on Children's Rights seriously in ways that are very creative. And obviously we have the example of how the Supreme Court has picked up the convention in Roper and Simmons, and another case law relating to children and sentencing. So I think you know, it's hard to dismiss or hard to ignore the lack of ratification, but I think there are some good examples of how the convention can nonetheless have an impact.
I don't have a huge lot to add to that, apart from it always makes for an interesting kind of question when you speak to children and young people about the kind of near universal ratification and ask them which country they think hasn't ratified, which we do. But I think following on from Ursula's point, that it's hugely important. Ratifications is what we need, but when you look around the country, look around the world at the human rights records of many countries that have ratified, the focus needs to be on implementation. Again, that's a really interesting discussion I often get into with children and young people, saying, does that mean that the US has got the worst children's rights record in the world? And actually, yeah, so absolutely important. But in terms of the influence that it has in terms of setting a standard for derogation, it's actually the implementation that we see that kind of leads the kind of drive to worse protections when states, including the UK, derogates from rights responsibilities and attacks human rights protections. That sends a very negative message internationally that others could do that. I don't get the same sense that the kind of lack of ratification from the US has that same impact as some of the derogations that we see in other parts of the world, like the UK, where the Human Rights Act is under attack, and that sends a very negative message about reducing rights protections.
Maybe if as a observing, I think, Brian, correct me if I'm wrong, but also CEDAW has not been ratified by the US, isn't it? So I don't think it is about children only. It has to do about this complicated idea that the US has as being the chosen country and to lead the others. And so why would they then abide by international law? And it has to do, I think, much more with internal dynamics of another kind than being open or not to children's rights, youth rights, etc. At least I recall, and in my literature, I always go back to Hilary Rodham's piece of 1972, Children Under the Law. And it is still such a great piece of work. And so many lawyers, legal scholars have given us, us elsewhere in Europe and in the world, tools to think about, to work with, and have been pioneering on children's rights. So I don't think it's something like the US would be against children's rights. But I do think we're to situate the debate. It's about its complicated relationship the country has, and of course its bipartisan system, and it's very, the way how politics are developing, that are stronger explanatory factors than just being in favor or against children's rights. I don't think that's where the nod lies. It's also CEDAW. And just to give, I had a student of mine did a work a while ago, but comparing CRPD, so the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And their Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities was adopted. And how comes and why? And while it was about a storytelling about veterans, war veterans who are living with a physical handicap. So, and they were included, and these are the heroes. and the women and the children not, and it's all about swap. This kind of that's how I understood it, of lobbying and counter lobbying and people having power of defining terms. That explains much more than I would say. And I think that in the country itself, there is, of course, a rich debate, and with all the different ideas around very paternalist, anti-child rights, but also very, very progressive ways of looking at children's rights and young people's rights. So I think that's, as an observer from outside.
Thank you. I have tried to unmute Linda and Ivy, and I'm not sure that has succeeded. I think we should say thank you for everyone attending, and I will, before I turn it over to Sonia to wind up, and Agnes, I just want to thank Ann Ghazi, who is the person behind the scenes, who's made all of these things magically happen. So thank you to Ann, and thank you to all the panelists, and Sonia, Lydia, and Anastasia, Jill, thank you.
On behalf of the Schubert Center for Child Studies, I'd like to thank our panelists, Ursula Kilkelly, Bruce Adamson, and Agnes Lux, our discussant, Carl Hansen, and moderator Brian Gran, and Linda Balog, and all of our guests who attended today. This very wonderful and informative international discussion on children's rights. I hope you all enjoy the rest of your day.
Yeah.
Thank you to Emily too, as well.